Thanks everyone from Arctic Basecamp. My name's Rainn Wilson. Obviously, I'm not an Arctic scientist, although I could play an Arctic scientist pretty convincingly, especially with the beard. Maybe someday I will have the opportunity to play an Arctic Basecamp scientist. Thanks so much for joining us. Why am I here? Well, I'm here to just help facilitate a discussion. That's all. Climate change is something that I have been passionate about for years. And frankly, I found myself not really doing a whole hell of a lot about it. Just an occasional angry tweet and kind of railing about it and buying a Tesla. That was the extent of my work in working in climate. So I really thought that it was about time for me to kind of get off my butt and do something and actually work toward a solution. And that's when I met the wonderful Dr. Gail Whiteman, who you'll be hearing from today, and with Arctic Basecamp. And it's a fantastic nonprofit that its focus, its target is speaking science to power. The catchphrase of Arctic Basecamp is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And we're going to learn more about that today at today's press briefing. I also learned that only 3% of nonprofit donations go to climate institutions. And I really wanted to help an organization like Arctic Basecamp, which is about speaking data, speaking facts. We need data and facts more and more these days. And getting that data out to the right people and brokering conversations. Arctic Basecamp has been doing some wonderful installations at Davos for the last many years, and we hope to do many more exciting installations. We're a bit limited by the COVID virus today. So this all kind of focuses on the Arctic. There was a big revelation about data points surrounding the Arctic that came out yesterday. We're going to address some of those with some amazing scientists and speakers today. I want to thank all the journalists that have showed up from around the world. Thank you so much for coming. I know you're really busy. There's a pandemic, there's an election, and the fact that you're paying attention to science coming from the Arctic Circle is really exciting. And I really greatly, it's so generous of you. So many, many thanks to you. Thanks also to Ballantyne's PR for helping us put this together. So we have some great speakers, and we're just going to start off today with the founder of Arctic Basecamp, Professor Gail Whiteman, and she's a scientific expert on global risk and an awesome human being. So Gail, why don't you kick this off? Why are we here? Tell us.
Well, hi, Rainn. First of all, it's great to see you again. It's almost a year since you and I went to Greenland. So lots has happened in the Arctic since that time. And it's not great news. It's a continually news that we have that the Arctic is in crisis. The science is very clear and it's very worrying. So the reason why we're here is to sound the alarm on the Arctic, to show that what happens there, and lots of not good things are happening there right now, that actually poses serious, serious global risks for the rest of us. And that's why we need to sound the alarm. Now, Arctic Basecamp is a science communication platform. We're not for profit. And what we do is try to get the message out. So I'd also like to say, first of all, thank you to you for sharing your time and your skills in communication with us. And also my fellow scientists on this panel today. And of course, the journalists are on the line, because we need your voices to actually share the facts and get those facts into decision makers' minds. And we need that because if we don't, the risks that we've seen from COVID will pale in comparison with the risks we will see on climate change. We also know that it's not just about bad news for the polar bear as the ice leaves, although that's certainly a sad story. It's also about the economic risks and the increasing costs of climate change that we will incur as we lose the Arctic sea ice. So the study that we did showed that if we lost the sea ice and if we lost permafrost that's currently obviously frozen in large parts of the Arctic, the cost of that on a discounted value would be hugely and wildly expensive, something like 66 trillion US dollars discounted for net present value now. So my team looks at the cost and the price tag, and that's just very expensive on top of the fact that we don't want to lose such an important and beautiful place on the panel. So today we're ringing the alarm, we're sounding the alarm, and in order to do that, I thought it was great to turn over to my colleagues who can give you much more detail on the actual science that we know today. Thanks, Rainn.
Great. Thank you, Gail. First, we're going to hear from Professor Julienne Stroeve from the University of Manitoba and University College London, who is a scientific expert on Arctic sea ice. And Julienne, what is going on in the Arctic this summer? Why the alarm bells? And unmute. And nice backdrop.
Thank you. That's actually from my time in the Arctic this past winter, although obviously that's not winter because the sun came back. But I did spend 4.5 months in the Arctic this winter as part of the year-long Mosaic expedition. And, you know, this winter was actually quite cold. It was on average minus 30 to minus 40 degrees on a daily basis. And, you know, we had quite a bit of ice formation. And when you look at the winter ice cover, it wasn't unusually low. In fact, it wasn't quite back to average, but it wasn't remarkable in any way. And in fact, it was stated that heavy winter ice conditions was part of the delay in the exchange, because I was only supposed to be in the Arctic for about 3 months and ended up there for 4.5 months. But then the summer happened, and the summer air temperatures got quite warm. In fact, May, July, and August set new records for the warmest temperatures recorded in the Arctic. And in fact, in Siberia, you had temperatures reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is quite unusual. And so, of course, what happened is this is going to still start enhancing the melt. And, you know, a particular summer can be warm, or it can be cold, it can be stormy, or it can be not stormy. But what we're finding in the Arctic today is it doesn't really matter what happens with the weather anymore. You're just going to have low ice conditions. And this year, we were, for a little while, on track to be the lowest ever recorded. But again, the ice is very sensitive to weather patterns, and you can't really say if one year is going to be a new record low or another. But it is the second time that the sea ice has dropped below 4 million square kilometers, which is something that hasn't happened in at least 40 some years that we've been having the satellite observations, and probably at least 150 years if we go back with earlier observations to about 1850, and probably a lot longer. So we're starting to see this transition to a lot less ice than we used to have in the Arctic. It's about 40 to 50% less than it was 40 years ago in the summertime. And while I'm not so concerned with whether or not we have a new record low from one year to the next, what I am interested in is that long-term trend. And that long-term trend is very largely linked to greenhouse gases that are causing global warming. I mean, we've seen that in studies that I've led with a colleague of mine. We've seen this in the climate models. And all of these studies show that there's a very strong linear relationship between how much CO2 we keep adding to the atmosphere and how much ice we melt. We were able to quantify that in our 2016 study, where for every metric ton of CO2 we add to the atmosphere, we lose another 3 square kilometers of sea ice, or 3 square meters of sea ice, sorry. But if you translate that into, you know, how much we're emitting, I mean, in 2019, we emitted, we write down 33 gigatons of carbon, and that equates to about 100,000 square kilometers of sea ice loss. So we can start looking at this also in terms of individual countries. So for example, China certainly is the largest emitter, and so they contribute the most to Arctic sea ice loss at about 30,000 square kilometers. The US is about half of that. But per person, actually, we're higher than in China. And what this does, though, is it really shows us a very strong limit on how much more CO2 we can add to the atmosphere before we'll see this transition to an Arctic Ocean that is going to be ice-free in summers. And at our current emission rates, which are about 35 to 40 gigatons of carbon per year, that is, you know, about another 700 gigatons of carbon we're going to lose summer sea ice. And so that's probably in the next 20 years. And this is really a good target for us to think about, because sea ice doesn't care about time. It doesn't matter when exactly it's going to happen. It matters how much more CO2 we add to the atmosphere. How much more global warming are we willing to endure before we lose the sea ice? And of course, once we lose that reflective sea ice cover, the ocean is going to warm up, and that's going to amplify the warming in the Arctic. And that will have a whole host of implications within the Arctic itself, but it also is connected to what happens at lower latitudes. And I know that's what Jennifer's going to talk about, so I won't go into that in detail. But basically, as we said in the beginning, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And so it does have implications for everybody else.
Thank you so much, Professor Stroeve. Our next panelist is the renowned Dr. Jennifer Francis from the Woodwell Climate Research Center. She's a scientific expert on the link between Arctic change and extreme weather in the mid-latitudes, including the California wildfires and other extreme weather events that have been going on around the globe. Dr. Francis, why when we say what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, what does that mean exactly? And how does that relate to events like the California wildfires?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Rainn, and thank you, Julienne and Gail, for that, for leading us into this topic. Certainly this year, 2020, has been just absolutely insane on many levels. One of them that we've heard about is what's going on in the Arctic and just the very unusual conditions happening up there, including, as Julienne said, this is the warmest summer we've ever seen in the Arctic, going back as far as we can look. And this is the connection to the wildfires that we're seeing out west. And also we'll talk a little bit about the hurricane season that we're seeing happening right now in the Atlantic basin, which again is an unprecedented set of circumstances happening there as well. The connection to the Arctic may seem rather tenuous, but in fact, it's quite direct. And what we think is happening is that because the Arctic is warming so fast, it's making the north-south temperature difference. So the difference in temperature between the cold Arctic and areas farther south is getting smaller. And that temperature difference is absolutely key to our weather patterns around the Northern Hemisphere. When that temperature difference is large, the jet stream, which is this river of wind over our heads that creates and steers all the weather patterns that we experience, will be strong when that temperature difference is large. But because we're warming the Arctic so fast, that temperature difference is getting smaller, the westerly winds of the jet stream are getting weaker, and the bottom line is that we're seeing weather patterns persist longer. They're getting stuck in place longer. So think about what's been happening out west with drought and heat waves, just unrelenting conditions that lead into much more severe conditions that are just what forest fires love to have. So dry vegetation and a lot of heat. So there's the connection to the Arctic for the West. And out in the Atlantic, where we're seeing just unbelievable numbers of tropical storms happening out there, and we still are, the connections there are through the fact that, as Julienne mentioned, we've lost over half of the ice cover on the Arctic Ocean. That means that the Arctic is now darker. We have much less of the ice there to reflect sunshine right back to outer space. Instead, it's warming the ocean, it's warming the planet. And global warming is at least 25% larger because we've lost all the ice and snow up in the Arctic. And so by increasing the amount of warming that's happening on the planet, we're also warming the oceans because they take up about 90% of that heat that's trapped by the greenhouse gases that we've been putting into the atmosphere. So that warmer water has been fueling all these hurricanes that have been forming out in the Atlantic, making them stronger, making them intensify more rapidly, and contributing to this record-breaking season that we've had this year. But just a couple more connections, that rapid warming in the Arctic is also causing the land ice in the Arctic, so glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet, to melt faster. That meltwater flows directly into the ocean and is causing sea level rise to increase even faster. that extra warming is also increasing the rate of permafrost thaw. Permafrost is the frozen soils that are way up in the high Arctic. And because they're frozen, they trap a lot of dead plants and animals in that soil. But as it thaws, the microbes in the soil can start to digest that organic matter. And the result of that is more carbon dioxide and more methane being released, both of which are greenhouse gases that are contributing to even more warming, even more heat being trapped. So in many ways, what's going on in the Arctic is affecting all of us through extreme weather, through faster sea level rise, and through even more warming happening through the release of extra greenhouse gases.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. Gail, tie this all up for us. We've heard a lot of information. Can you summarize what's going on and again bring us back to why we're having this conversation, why now, and what the urgency is?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rainn, and thanks, Julienne and Jennifer. Well, I think it's clear that the science is really convincing that the Arctic indeed is in trouble. We're losing a lot of sea ice, the temperatures are warming, permafrost is thawing, and that is affecting the rest of the world, whether it's through the jet stream or the warmer ocean, and that's causing us extreme weather patterns that are costly and incredibly disruptive to how all of us lead our lives. As I said earlier, the studies that we've been doing are showing that the economic impact of that over time is tremendous. It is much cheaper to actually fix the problem and stay within a 1.5 Celsius warmer world than it is just to let the Arctic sea ice melt and the permafrost thaw, and Greenland, of course, continue to melt. So it's now time to raise the alarm and sound it loudly. We've seen in this last period of time what seemed to be impossible happen, that in fact the world economies stopped because the world had to face a common threat, which was the pandemic. And by and large, a lot of good things have come out of that, where we've actually really had to work together as a system. But that pandemic was known by medical science, and just by and large, decision makers were not paying enough attention to that before the reality hit. And to some degree, that's understandable. But with climate change, we have been on about this for a long time, and the information is so compelling that absolutely it's time to act. So when we talk about sounding the alarm, we are doing that because the UN is holding its General Assembly this week in New York and virtually around the world, and indeed on Thursday has a high-level climate summit. And we believe that the world leaders attending that need to pay attention to the compelling evidence that science has on the Arctic and the global risks associated with that. So we actually avoid the next emergency as opposed to walking blindly into it. So we're really asking for four things here. The first is that we think science should be at the decision-making table. So science and the latest science should be part of the decisions that world leaders make. Just like in the pandemic, Dr. Fauci is alongside decision makers. We need, not necessarily us particularly, but climate scientists need to be in the room and need to make sure that those solutions make sense. Secondly, we need world leaders to ambitiously raise their commitments under the Paris Agreement to actually reach the 1.5 C target. The commitments that we have so far will mean a tremendous loss for the Arctic and will not avoid the worst impacts of climate change. In addition, there's a tremendous amount of trillions of dollars of COVID economic recovery money on the table, and very little of that is actually low carbon compliant. And that's concerning because if we invest all this money now to help the economy, but it actually puts us on a high carbon trajectory, we're walking into the next emergency. So we need also businesses to make sure that they're adopting science-based targets and making sure that how the goods and services they supply to us are on the right trajectory of the 1.5 target as well. And finally, what we need to do is make sure that citizens everywhere realize that it's also up to them to hold business and government accountable and make sure that we actually listen to the science. And if indeed we all unite behind the science, we believe that we can have a much better future.
Thank you so much, Gail. And just a reminder to members of the press and others gathered here, if you have questions for any of the panelists or questions in general, please put them in the chat feature and we can get to them at the end. Our next presenter, our next panelist is Julia Jackson, a good friend, wonderful human being, philanthropist, humanitarian, and most importantly for this conversation, she's the founder of Grounded, a nonprofit whose mission is to identify and advance scalable climate crisis solutions to ensure a thriving planet. And Julia, you have been impacted in so many ways by climate change, just personally. So I just kind of wanted to start things off with hearing a little bit about your personal story and how the Arctic and its effects on weather on the West Coast and forest fires has affected your life. And then we can talk about some of these solutions that Grounded has come up with.
Thank you so much for having me, Gail, and thank you to the press for being interested in this topic. Right now, there's fires raging back home. I'm currently in Arizona at the moment because I couldn't breathe with the air quality back home. I've, since 2017, been through 3 mega fires. The second fire, last October, I lost my home and I didn't have time to grab any of my possessions. And it's just a very surreal experience. I was reading that the amount of carbon emissions being released right now with the wildfires in California alone is equivalent to 90 million metric tons of CO2, which is adding more carbon to our already overburdened atmosphere. And so we really need to act now, and the Paris Agreement was great for verbal commitments, but what we need is action and to actually draw down atmospheric carbon, not just convert to a green economy. So my personal experience has been unprecedented wildfires in my home county. And really also what's scary is that some of the fires were started by arsonists, but a lot of them had to do with the climate crisis. And statistically, for every degree of warming, lightning, dry lightning, and global lightning in general will increase 10%. And so a lot of these fires happened with a very rare lightning storm that hit in the middle of the night. And there's already a lot of fuel for these fires because of climate change. There's a lot more brush and fuel. And so these fires are no longer just wildfires, they're turning into mega fires with their own weather systems. They're generating their own fire tornadoes, which they're calling fire-nados. And whole towns are being burnt down. And this is really such an existential crisis, and we have to turn this around, and it's directly correlated with the Arctic, losing our Arctic.
And what has Grounded discovered about solutions to this? We've been hearing a lot of data about the Arctic and their relation to the California fires. Is there any hope?
Yeah, there are so many amazing individuals out there with great frameworks. I think the general public assumes there will be like a silver bullet solution to reverse the impacts of the climate crisis, but we actually need a symphony of climate solutions. We need to deploy solutions, whether it's divesting from the fossil fuel industry and converting to renewable energy, but we also need to be implementing solutions that draw down atmospheric carbon, because we're at 400 and I believe 17 parts per million in the atmosphere currently, and counting, 3 to 4 parts per million every year. And so regenerative agriculture is a great solution because it can help sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Also rewilding, preserving vital carbon sinks in ecosystems all around the world. And I do think mandating legislative reform and making sure that the earth has lawyers advocating for these vital carbon sinks is a huge solution to reach what scientists are saying our 30 by 30 target, we must protect 30% of the planet by 2030 if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's the global safety net framework that just came out. That's a great from One Earth mandate for protection. And there's many other solutions as well. Of course, there's carbon capturing technologies, but those technologies aren't highly efficient at the moment. Do we need them? Yes, but those aren't the only solutions we should look towards. In fact, protecting nature is our biggest solution, and implementing more responsible land use and stewardship and honoring our natural environment is the biggest solution.
Thank you so much, Julia. Again, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat box. Some questions were submitted in advance, and we'll go ahead and go to those right now. Just going off of what Julia was just speaking about, one of the things that I've encountered in speaking to people about climate change is that individuals feel so powerless, and they feel like, well, what can I do? I'm just this tiny cog in this giant machine. There's 7 billion people out there. What does it matter, you know, what steps that I take? And I love that idea that there's a symphony of solutions, and they happen, and it needs to start on an individual level. But we also obviously need to address governments and corporations and intergovernmental organizations. So Gail, my question for you is, how do we reach these CEOs? How do we like get the data to them and pressure them, cajole them, force them to take action? Because so many of these large corporations, if they can make minor adjustments in their in how they do business and have tremendous impact. So you've been dealing with directly conversing with corporations and through Arctic Basecamp and your own work for decades. How do we reach them?
Well, thanks, Rainn. I think that's important. I mean, certainly big companies have been part of the problem and have certainly emitted a ton of CO2 over the years. But increasingly, there are clusters of CEOs and board members that believe in the science and are absolutely committed towards trying to reinvent the economy. And we've seen a big shift in the last 10 years. It has to spread and it has to accelerate. But one of the things we try to do when we talk to senior executives is we try to talk about the risks to them. So if you're an agricultural CEO and you make coffee, you might think, why do you have to listen to what's going on in the Arctic? Because you're not growing coffee in the Arctic. But in a sense, based on what Julienne and Jennifer have said, that as we lose that insurance policy, the Arctic sea ice, because it's the albedo effect, it puts the warm sunlight back out to the atmosphere. And if it goes into the oceans, and if it just raises temperatures, it affects precipitation around the world, which affects how you actually grow things like coffee and other, food commodity crops. So we try to talk about their material risks, and then we try to talk about how they can be heroes. And it's not just us doing that, but we do it through forums like the World Economic Forum. So we try to bring our message to where bunches of them gather, because we of course have no resources. We don't have big advertising budgets. What we do is we try to go in and then bring that message of change and risk and hope and get them on board with us. But there's lots of initiatives like We Mean Business and science-based targets for companies that are now really trying to think collectively, how do they deal with this big threats from climate change.
Thanks. I just want to do a follow-up question that came in, Gail, before I get to the other esteemed panelists. Catherine Mansell says, which goes hand in hand with what you were just addressing, do you think businesses are fully aware of the severe disruptions to their supply chains if extreme events linked to Arctic loss continue and worsen?
No, I don't think they are. It's a good question, Catherine. I think that they're becoming more so. I was with 300 CEOs and executives when Superstorm Sandy hit a number of years ago now. And it was electrifying because we had a climate scientist with us and we put him back up on stage to really explain why Superstorm Sandy was an unusual storm related to climate change, and he spoke quite eloquently about the link with the Arctic and the changes in the sea ice. And that was a surprise to them, because of course, storms like that were affecting their head offices, their infrastructure, and their supply chains. As we move forward, I think there's more awareness, but I still meet executives every day that don't think that the disruptions they're getting are climate costs. They think that's in the future. They think right now that's just extreme weather. So they're not getting the fact that that is a cost of climate change that's right now on their books, and we have to try and raise that message.
Thank you. And speaking of extreme weather, Dr. Francis, there was recently a study in the New York Times that was showing that climate deniers and people that are on the fence about climate change, or climate change skeptics or agnostics, can be reached through conversations about these extreme weather events. Have you found that to be the case? I know that this is a main point of both your study and your dialogue, is this connection between climate change and extreme weather events.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I found this connection to be a very useful one in communicating with all sorts of people, especially as these extreme events occur. You can talk about how they're becoming more frequent or more intense. That's in the data. They've experienced it themselves. It's affected their lives. It's maybe destroyed some of their property, or, even, I hope not, but, injured someone in their family. So, everybody loves to talk about the weather, and especially when it does crazy things. So when you can show them how climate change is actually making those kinds of events more intense or frequent, I like to think of it as sliding spinach into a cheeseburger, because the cheeseburger is the extreme weather. You've got their attention. And then you can show them something like the sea ice in the Arctic having half of it disappeared in just the last 40 years, and how that's such a visual and incredibly compelling aspect of climate change. And then we can talk about how the linkage works through these effects on the jet stream and weather patterns. So it really is a great way to open the door. The extreme weather is terrible. It's increasing in frequency. In fact, it's been estimated that we now have 3 times more weather-related extreme events than we had only back to 1980. So they've actually tripled over that time period. But the silver lining of that is that we have a lot of opportunities to use those to reach people, because so many people now are being affected by them.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. Let's bring Julia Jackson back to the Zoom. And a question for you. There was a question posed about regenerative agriculture. I know you know a fair amount of this from your business ventures and also working with Grounded, but Nicole Johnston asked, how can everyday people support regenerative agriculture, and can you tell us a little bit about why that's a solution, why and how?
Sure. Well, gardening in your backyard or on your rooftop and planting pollinator-friendly plants is a form of regenerative agriculture, because our pollinators are declining, and so regenerative agriculture really is omitting harmful synthetic chemicals from agriculture, and agriculture alone as a sector contributes to 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of people talk about carbon, but there are a lot of short-lived greenhouse gas emissions that are more potent than CO2, like nitrogen, for instance, or nitrous oxide, which is way more potent than CO2 and is released through nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So how we farm is really also contributing to the climate crisis. And if we start omitting and farming without the use of heavy chemicals and actually taking care of soil health, the soil starts to actually become healthier. the biome of the soil becomes more oxygenated and can therefore sequester more carbon from the atmosphere. And what's happening now is a lot of fallow land and heavily farmed with chemical land is contributing to the climate crisis. So we can actually turn our soils into a carbon sink. Globally, the statistic, I mean, scientists go back and forth on this, but the optimistic statistic to leave everyone with is that if regenerative agriculture was scaled globally, it could actually sequester 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, which would put us at pre-industrial levels of carbon. So just as one solution alone, how can everyday people support this? I think as a consumer, being aware of the food you're purchasing, shop local, eat with the seasons, support farmers markets. I know that there's a organic, beyond organic certification that just came out. It's regenerative organic, and companies like Patagonia are doing a really great job to champion regenerative agriculture and what it means. But essentially, as a consumer, how you can support is purchasing products that are farmed regeneratively, and look out for that certification. And then also, if you have the ability to create your own little pollinator-friendly garden without chemicals, that can also support.
Thank you so much. Professor Julienne Stroeve, if you could come back, is it too late to save the Arctic sea ice? Is there hope?
Well, I mean, I think that the main thing to understand is that the loss of sea ice is not an irreversible thing. So if we do transition towards a seasonally ice-free Arctic, this isn't irreversible. And we know this from running different climate model simulations, and we can bring it back. But at the moment, you know, Julie is completely right. I mean, we can't do this simply by drastically reducing our CO2. We're going to need to probably do carbon capture, because at the moment, if we look at these different emission scenarios that get us either to 1.5 or 2 degrees or even warmer by the end of the century, at those current sort of emission profiles where we take into consideration changes in people's consumption, changes in energy sources, those all sort of suggest at this point that regardless of what emission scenario we follow, we're probably going to see the first transitions towards an ice-free Arctic Ocean emerge in the next 20 years or so. And so this is quite sobering to realize, because we'd seen this already in the observations, and now the climate model simulations that go into the next IPCC report are confirming this is also the case. And so that is somewhat alarming, and it does make you feel like, well, you know, what can we do? And I think we really need to have many different solutions. It's not just reducing our CO2 emissions, it's also, we're going to have to start thinking and getting clever about how we can take carbon out of the atmosphere if we want to avoid this transition, which is something that hasn't happened in hundreds of thousands, if not longer, in terms of the time span of the Earth. And so it's not irreversible, but we are kind of running out of time now. And that is the real key message. And then all of those feedbacks that Jennifer talked about, the Arctic warming so much faster, and then you have in high gear. And so we are starting to run out of time, and we have to do something quickly.
Thanks, Julienne. And pun intended, you were frozen there for a while.
Yeah, my internet is not that great in the French Alps, I will say.
Oh, goodness. But thank you so much. Apologies for that terrible joke. Going off of what you said, Dr. Francis, why is sounding the alarm now so important? Why is this urgency? Why are we talking about this now at 2020 and not, I mean, we were talking about it 3 or 4 years ago, but there seems to be an excessive urgency to this moment. Why this moment?
Well, you know, I wish we were having this conversation back in 1980, because back then we would have had a little more runway available to really turn this big ship around. And it's not going to be easy to turn the ship around. Actually, we probably can't turn it around. We can only slow it down somewhat. I think we're talking about it now more aggressively. We're hearing about it more in the press. We're hearing all the different things that are being done at various levels of society, whether it's local or county or state, and some at the federal level. Things are starting to happen now, and I think it's because we're seeing the impacts of climate change unfolding in very blatant ways and expensive ways. And there's very little controversy now about the fact that that climate change is contributing to many of these very expensive disasters that we've seen, as I said, just increasing in frequency very clearly over just the last 40 years or so. You know, whether it's sea level rise and more flooding in Miami, or more forest fires in not just our West, but also Australia and Argentina and Brazil and other places. We're seeing more severe tropical storms affecting various parts of the world. You know, you can go on and on. Heat waves, cold spells, stormy periods. These are all now things that we can connect very directly at some level to the changing climate. And so this more solid foundation of scientific evidence is making it very clear that what is at play here. And so it's making it, I think, more people are realizing that this is a huge problem, and it's only going to get worse. We've got to start doing something about it. We can't make it go away, but we can certainly make the effects of it less severe in the future if we can rein in our emissions of carbon dioxide to zero and figure out a way to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as well. But what hasn't been mentioned yet is also, in parallel to all these things, we also need to get ready, because we are going to see more extreme events in the future. We cannot stop that. And so we need to, like my research, for example, is to try to better understand what kinds of extreme events are we going to see in different parts of the world, so that those decision makers there and the people who live there can get ready for what we expect to see happening more often in the future.
Thank you. Gail, a lot of people are talking about the economy under COVID, and we have a global recession. We've got all kinds of issues with, you know, restaurants and movie theaters, and that the attention and the focus should be on the economics post-COVID. What's your response to that, and how does climate change action fit into that discussion?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say that, you know, we are facing a tremendous economic threat throughout the world because of the pandemic and our reactions and necessary shutting down of the economy, parts of the economy. And that is a worry, of course, but the idea that we have to put the economics first and not the low carbon economy as if it's somehow separate is a complete myth. There's lots of studies showing that actually the green economy is good economics. So they're not separate. So it's not like, let's fix the economy first and then let's get to climate change. For two reasons: we don't have to do it, but also if we do that by trying to go a high carbon route in the economic recovery from COVID, we will close the window on preventing runaway climate change. So the risk from a global risk perspective is tremendously large. And what worries me and absolutely keeps me up at night is the fact that the COVID economic recovery money that has been already committed, very little of it is green, very little of it is low carbon. South Korea has done quite a good job. 38% of the funds that they're putting aside are low carbon oriented. But if we take a look at the UK, the US, China, it's tiny amounts of the money that they're pumping back into the economy that are actually green. And that means that we are just walking into a much bigger crisis. We all know how painful it is when people are out of work and we can't get the stuff. We have food shortages. And I really think that what we have to do is twin these things together. So it's absolutely essential that we bring them together. And I think we can do that. The low carbon economy is good business.
Great. And Julia, we don't want to get all political here, but obviously voting is important. And voting for science is important. Do you have anything to say on that path?
Absolutely. I believe it's absolutely critical to vote and register to vote, especially if you're a young person. I see voting and supporting science as key to our survival as a species. And so if we want to survive and really continue living on this planet, we have to vote for leaders that support the science and acknowledge that this is the most existential crisis we face, and will do everything in their power to help us turn this around.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up now. Thank you again to all the journalists that showed up. And I just want to say finally that I had the great fortune, as Gail referenced, to take a trip to Greenland with Gail and other members of Arctic Basecamp and witness the melting of the glaciers firsthand, and the changes that are happening up there, and exactly how they are affecting climate down in North America. We were flying across the Greenland ice cap, and the captain of the airplane pointed out the fact that it was dark below us. And he was talking about how this was soot from both industry and forest fires. So we think about these California forest fires, the smoke from them has, blanketed New York and reached all the way to Europe. And that particulate matter is landing on these polar ice sheets and turning them gray, and in some cases black. And so they're no longer reflecting with the magnitude that they were before the sun's energy. And this is also contributing. And I tell you, it was just really powerful seeing this stuff firsthand. If people want to check that out, I have a show, An Idiot's Guide to Climate Change. Gail is featured in, and it's a 5 or 6 part series on Soul Pancake, the digital media company that I co-founded. You can find it on their YouTube channel. So check out An Idiot's Guide to Climate Change. And as a former climate idiot, I've been learning so much and am in awe of these powerful, strong women that have been here on this panel, that are experts and tops in their field, and have are showing the way of speaking science to power. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Gail, any last words from you?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Rainn, for hosting us today and for supporting us over the last year. Science has the facts, and I hope that we've conveyed that to people on this call today. But we don't always know how to communicate that and to get that message out there. And we just believe that is the missing link. So people like you that do know how to communicate, and particularly the journalists here on the call, help us spread the alarm. Because if we do that, we have a chance. And if we don't, we're just going to, watch another disaster happen. So really, thank you so much for taking the time. You're a busy guy, I know. And also thanks to Sarah and Ashley from Valentine's for helping us do this from a press perspective, because that's not something that we normally do when we're at grad school studying science. We'd be happy to talk later if anybody needs any extra detail, and there'll be a lot on Arctic Basecamp website. So reach out to us and let's try and raise that alarm.
You can write us at info@arcticbasecamp.org. There's also an info sheet on the website. And Helen, thank you very much for putting this together. Helen from Arctic Basecamp did all the logistics. And there's a wonderful document that she has put in the chat here. I really encourage people to download it. It's a PDF, and it's an Arctic Alarm data points. It's just a series of data points that are that were referenced by the scientists that spoke today. And it puts everything into great perspective and with tremendous clarity. So please download that. And if you'd like a copy mailed to you, just write info@arcticbasecamp.org. So if anyone has any final words before we sign off? Anyone? Did I miss anything? We're good? Okay. Thank you
Okay.
again, all the panelists. Wonderful discussion. Dr. Jennifer Francis, Julienne Stroeve, Julia Jackson, and Professor Gail Whiteman. And thanks to all of you who attended today. Really appreciate it. So long.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rainn.